The so-called Nyquist theorem is almost a religious artifact for anyone who has any bit of formal training in digital audio. It's used as a kind of checkmate argument against analog purists who think that 44.1 digital is stair-stepped and doesn't sound good and is low res. Any questioning of the theorem makes you look like an uneducated hi-fi layman normie. So that's exactly why in today's video I'm going to blow that completely apart and show how what is taught in universities is completely wrong and what is regurgitated in the industry about the theorem is a load of twaddle. So I'm going to assume that most people watching this video have already heard about the Nyquist theorem. If not, the way that it's commonly thrown around in the industry is something like this. You need to have a sample rate double or higher than the highest frequency that you want to hear, and then you're guaranteed perfect fidelity. For example, a human ear hears up to about 20k if you're lucky, and then we can double that and get to 40k, and if we have a sample rate of 40k or higher, then we can hear everything that the human ear is capable of hearing in perfect fidelity, and we're guaranteed that because the theorem says so. And if you disagree with the theorem, then you're an idiot. Checkmate. That's basically how it goes in the industry, and that's used to argue with hi-fi guys who are like, yeah, but 44.1, you've only basically got around 2 samples and it's not high enough fidelity. You get these weird stair steps and that can't perfectly reproduce the frequencies. What you're talking about, it's so granular. How does that work at all? Vinyl is way more accurate, way more pure because you don't have these 2 samples at 20k, you've got molecules. And then the digital advocate will hit back and say, no, you don't know what you're talking about because we use a low pass reconstructive filter and all that stair step stuff goes away. That's just theoretical. Actually, it's a lollipop graph and not stair step anyway. And when we reconstruct that after the low pass filter, we get back the perfect 20k tone. So you don't know what you're talking about. And they will often link a video like Monty Montgomery's great video on this topic. But even that video doesn't give the full story, and it gives more of the impression like the way that it's taught at universities, which in this day and age is unfortunately completely wrong. So if you're a hi-fi enthusiast, an analog purist, and you think that CD quality digital doesn't sound good because it's too low res, then you're wrong. And if you're a digital advocate and you explain digital technology in the kind of way that I've just explained it, then you're wrong as well. Even universities teach this, everyone online teaches it in this way, but it's just really outdated to the point where it's just wrong. Even the name Nyquist theorem is wrong. Now, Harry Nyquist published a paper almost 100 years ago now called Certain Topics in Telegraph Transmission Theory. In that classic paper, Nyquist discusses a whole bunch of different things, but one of the things that he is discussing is Fourier decomposition, how all sounds can be broken down into a bunch of sine waves. And the paper is, of course, especially easy to read, as you can see here. But the place where the layman's Nyquist theorem comes from is not actually from Harry Nyquist himself, but rather from Claude Shannon's formalization of what Nyquist said in his 1949 paper, Communication in the Presence of Noise. Now, as you probably guessed, having a PhD in mathematics would help you out reading this paper, but it's not actually that difficult to understand, especially if we only look at the part of the paper that we're interested in terms of what people call the Nyquist theorem today, because he writes about a whole bunch of other stuff. Shannon was an absolute legend in many different fields, but part of his paper writes about exactly what we're talking about here with the Nyquist theorem. So the theorem, as stated in Shannon's paper, is if a function contains no frequencies higher than w, it is completely determined by giving its ordinates at a series of points spaced half w seconds apart. He then gives a mathematical proof of this, but to understand what he means, what's going on there, you have to understand the context of what he's writing about there. The context is he's talking about math. He's talking about a Fourier transform function going from discrete to continuous domains, and he says that we can perfectly reconstruct that by using pulses, and the amplitude of the center of each pulse is simply the sample value. And the sum of all of those pulses becomes the perfectly reconstructed output. And what he's referring to as pulses, he then later defines, and that is what we would refer to today as a sinc function. So it's getting a bunch of different little sinc functions centered at the amplitude, and then sum them all together, and voila, there you go. You have the sum again, which is a perfect equivalent of the original signal. And that is a mathematical theorem, mathematical proof that he does, and it doesn't necessarily refer to what people have in their mind when they think of digital audio. Now, whether that was as clear as day or mud depends on how much you know about math, but you don't really need to understand that. I'm just trying to make the point that what is taught at universities on audio engineering degrees today is completely oversimplified and not what was stated by Shannon's original paper. So I'm going to refer to what people commonly teach and understand about how digital audio sampling works as the outdated method. Now, this is problematic for a whole bunch of different reasons. So let's say the original layman theorem says if you have your sampling rate twice that of the highest frequency you want to sample, then you're guaranteed perfect fidelity. Well, let's say we take a 20K sine wave and we have a sampling rate at 40K. Well, what happens if the sample intervals falls on the zero crossings of the sine wave? Well, now we record nothing. We record silence because every time we take a sample, it's at zero. So we don't know that there's a sine wave there at all. So the input is a sine wave and the output is silence. So we don't have perfect guaranteed fidelity at all. We have it's nonsense. So that doesn't work at all. What happens if we lower the pitch of the sine wave at 20K slightly down to 19.99 something K? Well, now it's going to slightly shift the phase angle over time relative to the sampling interval. So now we're going to be sampling at the top of the sine wave, and then as it gets lower down to the zero crossing, then it's going to have a lower amplitude, and then it's going to get louder again. So we're going to have this fading in and fading out of that high pitch sine wave. So that's not perfect fidelity at all. And if we lower the pitch even further, it's going to happen quicker and quicker and quicker. The beating will speed up. We'll have a beating effect. And that will get quicker and quicker until at some point the frequency is low enough that that beating effect disappears. So now onto the next problem of the outdated method. So all digital audio systems low pass filter the input signal to get rid of the high frequency content that might go above the Nyquist frequency. That is half the sample rate. Because if stuff goes above half the sample rate, then it starts getting mirrored back in to below half the sample rate because of the ambiguity of having less than two samples to sample it. So that's called aliasing. It sounds really bad. A lot of people have heard the term aliasing. It doesn't sound good. We want to avoid that. So we need to low pass filter the signal. But let's say we have CD, for example, 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate. Well, half that is 22.05. Let's just say 22. Well, we want to hear sounds up to 20K. So we only have room between 20K and 22K to do a low pass filter to go from letting everything through at 20K and then killing everything at 22K. It had to be such a steep filter. That's just ridiculous. If you calculate it, it has to be something close to 600 dB or more per octave to get down to something like 90 dB attenuation at 22K. It's just way too steep. And anyone who's used a filter knows that the more steep the filter is, the weirder it sounds or more resonant it is, especially with analog filters, they get really resonant. So now we run into some huge compromises. Do we want to have the cutoff frequency lower and then cut off all of the high frequency sparkle of our music, but then we reduce the aliasing and can have a slightly less steep filter? Or do we want to have more high frequency content in our music, but then risk aliasing or have an excessively steep filter, which just sounds really horrible? Well, really early digital technology used higher order elliptical filters, which are insanely steep brick wall analog filters. But the thing is with those is you've got trade-offs. So if you have it so steep, something must give. And what gives is you have huge amounts of ripple in the passband. So that makes the high-end frequency response really uneven and weird. So that's why some of this really old digital technology sounded metallic and unnatural and weird, partly because of the analog filters involved were really high order elliptical filters, and it just sounds bad even in the analog stage. Nothing to do with the digital, just the analog front end of the filter is just weird and bad. So using this outdated method, we have massive problems in terms of our frequency aspects, but we also have massive problems in terms of our dynamic range aspects too. And that's because a digital audio system, the dynamic range is largely determined by the quantization error. That's where you get the noise floor is mainly quantization error noise. Quantization noise is evenly distributed across all frequencies up until the Nyquist frequency. Now, this is where the problem comes in for the outdated method. I'm going to use a bit of an analogy because it's easier to conceptualize. Imagine if you have some peanut butter and you have a slice of toast, and the slice of toast is fairly small, and you've got this peanut butter on the knife and you spread it across the bread and you've got a fairly thick layer of peanut butter. Now, if you were to take the same amount of peanut butter on that knife, but spread it across a huge, oversized, gigantic piece of toast, you're going to be spreading out, and it's going to be like really thin. That peanut butter is going to have a really thin layer spread across all that big slice of toast. Now, this is like quantization noise. If you have a small bandwidth, your Nyquist frequency is like 22K, then all of your quantization noise is spread, focused evenly within that bandwidth up to 22K. But if you oversample and have a way higher sampling rate, then the quantization noise is evenly spread all the way across that really thinly. And then you can come along and low pass that, cut all of that stuff off, and then you're left with just a bit that you want. And now your quantization noise from the oversampled one is way quieter than the one that you just did at the normal sampling rate. So does CD quality sound bad, 44.1? Well, if you're using the outdated method, of course it sounds bad. It sounds horrendous. You've got terrible dynamic range because your quantization noise is the highest it can pretty much possibly be. You've got terrible frequency response because you're using high audio elliptical filters, and they've got a really metallic, weird sounding top end. It just sounds awful. You've got beating at very high frequencies. It's just a complete disaster. It's horrendous. Of course, that's why, since before I was born, no manufacturers are using that method. That's completely outdated. No one is doing that anymore. Since before I was born, all good high quality digital audio equipment uses oversampling. As far as I'm aware, what I'm about to tell you is not typically taught on your average university audio engineering degree course when learning about digital audio. And the crazy thing is, most of the manufacturers of audio interfaces and DACs, hi-fi stuff, they probably don't even know this process either. Why is that? It's because all of the manufacturers of modern audio interfaces, converters, all this stuff, the hi-fi stuff, they're all just using off-the-shelf chips by AKM, Texas Instruments, Cirrus Logic. You can get an 8-channel, pristine quality, latest technology conversion chip for 20 quid. Like, why are you going to design it yourself? No one's doing discrete stuff nowadays. Everyone just buys the chips from the big manufacturers. You don't need to know how the chips work. You don't need to know about anything about this process. All you need to do is plug in the chip, supply it with the right voltage, get the inputs and outputs right, and away you go. All of the conversion is done. It's not a little bit of the process. It's all of the process is done in the chip. And all of these companies are just buying the chips. So all of this marketing hype when they're like, yes, our pristine, legendary character of our sound quality and blah, 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 and all of this marketing stuff, it's just complete nonsense. They're obviously designing the enclosure of the audio interface and the I/O and speccing it and designing it. There's a lot of design work that goes into it. But in terms of the actual conversion, they're not really doing they probably don't even know how the conversion works. All of the main manufacturers are just using all of the same chips from AKM and Cirrus Logic and Texas Instruments. There's a few core manufacturers that make these chips. So you can go over to Texas Instruments and they've got absolutely amazing videos explaining exactly how the process works. Now you can just go and watch this video, which I'll link down below, of exactly how the process works, but it is a tiny bit technical. So I'm going to make a simplified version now so everyone can understand it on a bit more of a basic level than what is in the original Texas Instruments video. Now, if you look at the left, what is entitled SAR, this is what I'm referring to as the outdated method. Now, this isn't outdated in all industries, it's just outdated in digital audio. So you can see that at the sample point, it's a snapshot of the voltage. And so the sample points can be overlaid upon the original voltage, as you can see on the left. But that doesn't actually sound good for all of the reasons I've just discussed. So instead, on the right, we have the modern approach, which is not actually that modern, it's been used for years, but this is the delta sigma approach. Now, this is a bit more complicated, but if you only take away one thing from this, it's the fact that it's first sampled at a way higher sample rate, and then lots of samples are averaged together to arrive at the actual sample that will be used at the sample rate stated on the audio interface. So if your audio interface says that you're recording at 44.1, well, actually, maybe your delta sigma chip inside your audio interface actually sampled at 20 million samples a second, but then just averaged those millions of samples down into 44.1 thousand samples per second. So each sample isn't a snapshot of the voltage like we've got on the left. Rather, it's an averaging down of a whole bunch of samples. So then we get a more meaningful representation of each sample point. So the sampling actually occurs in the modulator. And although modern systems are multi-bit, the original delta sigma is just 1 bit. That's right, it's not 16 or 24-bit, it's 1 bit. Most people find it extremely unintuitive how you can get a higher quality signal out of just 1 bit. So I'm going to use an analogy to make it a bit more easy to understand. Imagine a restaurant which only accepts $100 bills as payment, but you really like this restaurant and you eat there every day and you order the same thing every day. So your bill actually always comes to $27.43. But remember, you can only pay with a $100 bill. So what do? The first day you go there, you give them a $100 bill. But the second day, you've already paid for it, so you don't need to give them any money. The third day, you've already paid for it, you don't give them money. And then it goes on like this until the fourth day, you're in debt with them, so then you need to give them another $100 bill. And let's say you do this every day for a couple of weeks. We can actually draw a graph of this and see how the orange line, which represents the average amount paid for your meal over time, converges with the green line, which represents the price of the meal itself. The blue line there are the spikes of the cash injection. Every time you give $100, there's a blue spike, and then the rest of the time, you don't give them any money. So actually, you only either pay $0 or $100 bills. So this analogy shows us that even with one bit, so $100 or no dollars, so on or off, just with an on and off state, we can actually get a precise value over time when we average it out. And this is exactly how the delta sigma topology works. It's essentially the same thing, but it's done with a comparator and an integrator and an electronic circuit instead. So given a sufficiently high clock speed, even just with one bit, we can get a really high quality representation of the input signal. You get a constant output of ones and zeros based upon the input voltage. If you look at that chart, you can see where the voltage is a bit lower, you've got more sparse ones, and where the voltage is higher, you've got more dense ones. And now we can average these bits. So let's say we've got 20 ones and zeros in a row. Or we can add all of these bits up and come up with a number which represents the sample recorded at the lower sample rate, like the 44.1. So that's how we get from a 1-bit really high sample rate down to a 24 or 32-bit lower sample rate like 44.1. And that's also why the red sample point in this picture is not sitting on the blue original voltage line, but it's an average of it in that particular time period. Now, this is what I was saying about peanut butter. On the left, we've got the outdated approach. So we have our regular 44.1 sample interval, and then we have the maximum amount of quantization error noise. But then on the right, if we oversample that, then we've got a way wider frequency range that we have available. And so the noise is spread out thinner across that entire range. But we're going to chop all that off and just have what is on the left-hand side of that red arrow. So we actually effectively have way less noise and way more dynamic range. In fact, the dynamic range on modern converters is even better than that, because what you can do with the second or third order delta sigma modulator, you can shift the noise, do a type of noise shaping approach. And although if you add it all up, the sum of all of your quantization error noise is going to be the same, you can just shift it into the higher frequencies, so you have more in the higher frequencies and less in the lower frequencies, and then you just low pass filter it all, and then you've got less noise in the band of actual interest that you want to listen to, and you just chop off all of the noisy stuff on the high frequencies that are above the range of human hearing anyway. Now we have a fantastic quality signal which is stored at 44.1 or whatever sample rate you're working at, without having to use brick wall filters that sound terrible or be subject to any of the horrible stuff that we described before with the outdated approach. So, of course, in this video, I wasn't debunking Claude Shannon's formalization of the sampling theorem. I was debunking this layman Nyquist theorem, which is thrown about online and often taught at universities when studying digital audio. Now, of course, 44.1 as a storage medium is completely fine if you've got a delta sigma front end or some oversampled front end. Storing at 44.1 is absolutely fine and sufficient for perfect fidelity in the full range of human hearing. However, as a sampling rate, as an actual raw sampling rate interval, it's completely inadequate and it sounds absolutely horrendous. And all of the digital equipment that we have access to nowadays doesn't do that. That's not how digital equipment works at all. All but the oldest, most vintage dinosaur digital audio equipment that was low-tech, low-end, and sounded horrendous, even slightly more moderately priced, or even at some periods in the late 70s, you could have got a bit more of expensive stuff that did this rudimentary. It actually was operating with an actual clock rate of 44.1, and it sounded horrendous, and that's why digital got a bad reputation originally, because of the elliptical filters and all the horrendous stuff that happens as a result of using 44.1 as a raw actual sample rate. But that hasn't been used since literally the early 80s. on any sensible product at all. So anyway, I hope you learned something in this video, and anytime someone throws the Nyquist theorem at you online, direct them to this video so they can be fully debunked.